Now we're on record. So before I proceed, I want to find out if I'm audible. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Yes, sir.
Okay, then let me share
Yes, sir.
Now I'll share my screen and go to our group on Sakai Group 10 main campus. I've come to our course syllable and I'm going straight to our schedule of work, which we finished with our last class. So I'll just go through the schedule of work before I receive any questions. We started by looking at speech acts. We distinguished types of sentence-shaped thought. And then we recognize sentence fragments and emotive expressions. We identified different types of declarative sentences. We contrasted facts and values. So this was a slide we used for speech act. We saw interrogative sentences, sentences spoken to solicit information. We saw imperatives, which are sentences spoken to get someone to do something. We saw declaratives, which are sentences spoken to convey information. We saw different types of declaratives, factual statements, value judgments, definitions, and arguments. We saw factual statements, statements that convey information about the external world. We saw definitions, which are sentences spoken to convey information about meaning. We saw value judgment, which are sentences spoken to pass some kind of judgment on something's suitability, moral or otherwise. We saw the two types of value judgments. We saw the moral and non-moral, and then we saw emotive expressions and sentence fragments. And then that was our first class. For the next class, after that, we treated definitions. So this was the slide we used on definitions. And we saw types of definitions, but before that, we distinguished between two parts of a sentence in a definition. We saw definiendum and definiens. We said definiendum is like the subject and definiens is like the predicate. We said definiendum is that part of the sentence that is being defined, and indefiniens is that part of the sentence that is doing the defining. From there, we saw types of definitions. We saw lexical definitions, ostensive definitions. The lexical ones are the dictionary ones. The ostensive ones are the ones you can't describe or write down except by demonstration, physical demonstration. Then we have the theoretical ones that originated from specific disciplines, academic disciplines. And then we saw stipulative definitions, definitions that any of us can formulate at any time for a particular purpose. Then we saw operational definitions, definitions that outline a kind of procedure or operation. And then we saw the essential definitions. And we said they are the only definitions we call real definitions, because of their accuracy. And then from there, we saw problems with definitions. We were saying that definitions could be too broad if the definiens is referring to items that are beyond what is needed to define the definiendum. And then we said the definition is too narrow if the definiens is referring to items that are not enough to define the definiendum. We said the definition is vague if there is no way of telling the class of things definiens refers to. And the definition is ambiguous if it is generating more than one meaning. And then the definition is secular if the definiens is merely repeating the definiendum. Morality is to be morally right, And then a definition begs the question if the definition is obscure or digresses from providing meaning. So that was what we did about definitions. After our class on definitions, we went on to take another class on discourse, types of discourses. Now I have the slides on discourses here. We can see types of discourses. We say the discourse is a passage, and we have basically two categories of discourses or passages. We have argumentative passages or non-argumentative passages. And we said an argument is a passage containing a conclusion and premise or premises. We saw an example of an argument. We saw how to identify arguments, and then we moved to non-arguments. We saw narratives, instructional passages, rhetorical polemic. We don't need to repeat what a narrative is. It's a report of a sequence of events. Or instructional passage is a collection of imperatives. But rhetorical polemic is worth commenting on because it's similar to argument, but it's not argument. Now, we were saying that rhetorical polemic will contain claims just like arguments, but whilst the claim in an argument is supported by premises or which bears surrounding reasons or supporting reasons, the claims in a rhetorical passage is surrounded by emotive expressions. Then we moved on to see verbal and real disputes. We said verbal disputes are disputes arising from confusion or unresolved meanings of words. But the real disputes are the ones that arise out of conflict about facts or values. So that was that about discourses. After our discussion on discourses, we moved on to discourses on the different senses of law, at the normative and empirical. And here we started by reminding ourselves of the difference between values and facts. We said values are about what we should or should not do. Facts are about what is or is not. But we said sometimes you can see a factual statement that is actually a value judgment. We gave an example. The president has lifted a lockdown. That's a factual statement. The president has rightly lifted a lockdown. That's a value judgment, no longer a factual statement. From there, we saw metaphors and proverbs. We said metaphors are sentences that shouldn't be interpreted literally. It's raining cat and dogs. It doesn't have a reasonable literal interpretation because cats and dogs don't fall from the sky. It's only when you interpret it non-literally that it makes sense, such as it's raining heavily. But for proverbs, proverbs have reasonable literal meanings and also reasonable non-literal meanings. So both the literal and non-literal meanings of proverbs are reasonable. So that's the difference between a proverb and a metaphor. And then another difference, which is important, is that the non-literal meaning of a proverb is often a piece of advice. Okay, then from there we saw meaning defects in language. We saw vagueness, ambiguity, and then we saw equivocation. And we said equivocation is to take advantage of the ambiguity of a word. Okay, so that was it. And then we went to senses of law. We saw natural law, civil law, cultural norms, customary law, moral, logical law, mathematical laws, and divine laws. And that ended our language section of the course. After that, we went into arguments, and then our first class after that was deductive reasoning. Now for deductive reasoning, we said it is reasoning in which the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a logical relationship. Because of this, it is reasoning that permits only one conclusion. We gave examples. We distinguish between two parts of a sentence in an argument. We saw reference and attribute classes, and we will say there are two kinds of reference classes: the finite and infinite. And because of that, there are two kinds of statements. You have universal and particular statements. And then we discussed validity. We said an argument is valid if the premises and the conclusion are following the correct rules for deductive reasoning. We compared deductive reasoning to an inductive reasoning, and we saw why an argument can be called an inductive argument, and that's because they permit more than one conclusion. Then we saw the hidden conditional if and then. We said all arguments have hidden conditionals. Now, from there we saw how to identify antecedents and consequence. We said in order to find out antecedent and consequence, you need to look at all the premises, begin to convert the premises one by one into conditional statements. Usually it is only one premise that you can convert to a conditional statement, and that premise is where you will locate the antecedents and consequence. From there, you can do the rest of the mathematics. And in mathematics is either resulting on in affirming the antecedent, denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, or denying the consequent. And we said the rule for deductive reasoning is that you only affirm the antecedent and deny the consequent in order to reach a valid conclusion. Then we saw that affirming the antecedent is a valid modus ponens, but denying it is a fallacy. We also saw that affirming the consequent is a fallacy, but denying the consequent is what we call valid modus tollens. We use all kinds of techniques to get that lesson across. We used symbols, we used graphs, we used boxes, And after that, we went to hypothetical syllogism. We saw how a hypothetical syllogism works. The consequent of a particular premise becomes the antecedent of the very next premise. And then the conclusion does what? The conclusion brings together the very first premise and the very last consequent. We saw two fallacies, two hypothetical fallacies. And then after that, we saw disjunctive syllogism. So disjunctive syllogism has no fallacy, or you would say that the fallacy of disjunctive syllogism is too obvious for anyone to commit. I mean, you can't say either A is true, B is true, A is true, therefore A is false. Or you cannot say either I become a reverend father or I got married, therefore I did not get married. No one will commit that kind of fallacy. Even a child knows that the fallacy is too simple and will be detected as a fallacy. From there, we saw validity versus soundness. We're asking whether soundness requires validity alone, and we saw that an argument can be valid but not sound. For an argument to be sound, it needs both validity and truth. That was what we did about inductive arguments. After that, we went to deductive arguments. We're saying that unlike a deductive argument, inductive reasoning is an argument where the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not logical. And the premises are capable of producing more than one conclusion. And then we said inductive arguments, the premises give you reason to believe in the likelihood of the conclusion, but the premises don't guarantee the conclusion. So because of that, inductive arguments are probability arguments. Okay. So we saw verifiable and confirmable statements. And we saw how they are combined in an argument. We said the verifiable statements are usually the premises, the confirmable statements are usually the conclusions. We said confirmable statements are also called hypotheses. And you have two kinds of hypotheses or confirmable statements. You have the law-like hypothesis and you have the statistical hypothesis. And so based on that, we classified two kinds of inductive arguments based on the two kinds of conclusions. We have inductive arguments ending with law-like hypothesis as conclusion, and then we have inductive arguments ending with statistical hypothesis as conclusions. So then we also said that inductive arguments are, basically extrapolations. And talking about extrapolations, we saw the different directions of extrapolation. You have part-whole extrapolations, which consists of generalizations and statistical syllogisms. We saw the generalization, we saw the statistical syllogism, we saw analogies, we saw predictions, And then we compared inductive to inductive arguments. We were saying that deductive arguments are accurate at the expense of providing information, but inductive arguments provide information at the expense of accuracy. So the advantage of one is the disadvantage of the other. And that was what we did about inductive arguments. Then we went to causal reasoning. We saw causal reasoning. We're saying causal reasoning is really a kind of inductive argument. A kind of inductive argument that reasons from cause to effect. Now, because causal reasoning is not 100% accurate, we cannot classify it as a deductive argument. So we have to classify it as belonging to the inductive category. So reasoning from cause to effect, we saw different senses of the word cause. We saw proximate cause, contributory cause, necessary cause, sufficient cause, we saw probabilistic cause, we saw causal agent, we saw causal chain and web, and then we went over to studying the three different patterns of informal causal reasoning. And we selected them out of the 5 that John Stuart Mill had proposed in his book. The first one, relevant difference, we were saying that you can look for something that is different or something that is different in an environment in order to explain a recent problem in the environment. That's for relevant difference. And then for common thread, you can look for something that is common to all the cases of a particular problem, so that you can see if it explains that problem. Then we saw concomitant variation. We said concomitant variation is used to study something that is always in the environment which you cannot eliminate, to find out if that thing is occurring at a degree that is unhealthy. So we use it to examine whether something like carbon dioxide in the air, or sulfur dioxide, or even selenium in the soil, whether these things are occurring in frequencies or intensities or degrees that are producing ill health, in human beings. After that, we moved over to the causal fallacies, or the instances of bad causal reasoning. The first one we saw was the post hoc ego propter hoc, saying that because A happened before B, A might have caused B. It's not always the case. Not everything that happens before the other caused it. Then we have non-causal pro-causal, exchanging cause for effect. If A caused B and you say that it is B that caused A, then you have committed non-causal pro-causal. Then we saw oversimplified cause, when there are a certain number of causes and you don't identify all the causes of something, then that's oversimplified cause. Then we saw false common thread, when you identify something as a common thread that is not actually a common thread. If you say that all the bright people in your class have cars, so you have to get a car in order to be academically bright, that would be a false common thread. Then we saw confusing correlation with causation. We said correlation is not always causation. The fact that two things always happen together doesn't mean that one of them is causing the other. Then we saw slippery slope. When you argue that if something happens, it will lead to a more serious consequence, and that consequence will lead to an even more serious consequence, and the consequence continue to lead to other consequences, and the order of seriousness will continue increasing, without justification. We saw different examples, and that was how we ended the class on causal reasoning. After that, we discussed informal fallacies. By the time we were discussing informal fallacies, we had already seen many other kinds of fallacies. We saw fallacies of meaning, vagueness, ambiguity, equivocation. We saw formal fallacies, denying the antecedent, affirming the consequent, hypothetical fallacies. We also saw causal fallacies. So for this particular class, we treated some other new fallacies like grandstanding, but before that, we also saw two fallacies of meaning, like equivocation. We saw equivocation in arguments, how you can commit equivocation in an argument. We also saw how you can commit secularity in an argument. After that, we went to some new fallacies, grandstanding, appealing to majority. We said appealing to majority is a fallacy because majority is not always right. Then we saw this very common, probably the most common fallacy, praising or attacking people instead of their arguments, instead of addressing their arguments. So you accepting an argument by praising whoever made the argument, or rejecting an argument by attacking the personality or even insulting whoever made the argument. So those are ad hominem arguments. Then we saw the appeal to authority, appealing to authority for an argument instead of defending it technically. And then we saw genetic fallacy, which is to say that something is right or wrong depending on where it comes from. We saw appeal to threat, which is to tell people that something will happen to them if they don't accept your argument. We saw appeal to pity, which is to whip up sentiments. And we saw fallacies of manipulating the data. We saw three of them. We saw fallacy of misplaced vividness, using a vivid example or case to deny a general problem. We saw semi-attached figures, where you defend a conclusion by referring to statistics that don't quite fit the conclusion. Then we saw history generalization, which is to judge an entire population based on a few samples in the population. And I think that was the last thing we saw in that class, and that ended the semester for us. So now I'm going to take a few questions from you before I post your Sakai. So if you want to ask a question, you raise your hand and then you go ahead. We'll address your question before we end the class. So Edwin Winston. Edwin, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask whether then the consequence have the antecedent, is it composite that we are going to also have the consequence?
Come again.
I said in the deductive argument, do we always have the antecedent and the consequent in the argument, or we can have only the antecedent in argument and only the consequent?
No, once you have an antecedent, then it implies there's a consequence. If you have a consequent, then it implies there's an antecedent.
Okay. So please, my second question. About also the deductive argument, deductive reasoning. So please, during our assignment, give us some examples based on modus ponens and modus tollens. And when I tried to apply the mathematical thing taught us about the if A then B, it became so long for me. Like example, like if the president win the election, then then he did a campaign. If he did a campaign, then he had money, and it continues and continues before the conclusion was given. So I wanted to ask how we are going to tackle such a question, how long it is.
Yeah, that was an argument with many premises. So it's really an exercise of what you learned. We teach with arguments with two premises. But when you dealing with an argument with more than two premises, you just identify the particular premise where you have the antecedent and consequent. And then from there, you can just add up the rest of the premises. You see how the rest of the premises are building on that premise. So it is basically the same skills, only that you are required to look at more premises.
Yes. And about statement, give us a statement like, I wanted to ask the type of statement. We wish you came out of first class. Whether it's imperative or it's a factual statement. I found it.
Yeah, Edwin, you need to bring your mic closer to your mouth, because some of what you said were not captured by the mic. So repeat that last question.
I said a statement. I came across a statement like, we wish to come out with first class, and I was discussing with a friend whether it was factual statement or it was an imperative statement. We wish you came out with first class.
That's an emotive expression.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. And then Cynthia.
And, please, I'm not done.
Okay.
Please, the emotive statements, do they always end with an exclamation mark?
No, they don't.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. Then Cynthia.
Sir, please, when are you writing our IE?
That should be as from Monday.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And then for all those who had difficulties of whatever nature, both technical and other difficulties with all the assessments, I'll consider giving you another chance sometime after the IE. All right, so those who are no longer asking questions, you have to put down your hands so that I'll see how many people are still asking questions. Edwin, do you still have a question to ask? Okay, now what about Cynthia? Are you still asking a question?
No, sir, I'm about to lower my hand.
Okay, good. And what about Mauricia? Mauricia, can you go ahead?
Okay, sir, please, it's about the first assignment. The results are not showing.
Yeah, because it is still being graded.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Lawrence Ofosu.
Yeah, okay, sir. I wanted to ask the mode of the end of semester exam. Will it be online or it will be face to face?
This is me and my family.
I think, it will be set by the coordinator. So he's making plans. Very soon he will send you a message detailing all the modalities.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So now at this point, I'm going to end the class and upload the video to Sakai. Since this is our last meeting, I encourage you guys to keep working hard, work very hard so that you will be great people, responsible citizens. Remember to obey all moral principles, avoid whatever is wrong, always do what is right so that you contribute to the country and the continent. All right, so
Yes, sir.
goodbye.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 We love you. Bye.
Bye.
Samara.
Love you guys.
Good.
And tell them.